Action RPG enjoyers, welcome to the Bloody Bird build. Now, some of you may be familiar with this build already. I had previously done a video which was more of a concept guide. Now, this is the full fat, everything is set in place and in stone. Technically not in stone, but more on that later. And I just want to give you a video in 3 parts, ideally. The first part is going to be the build, you know, what gear you want, what skills you want, passives, idols, blessings, etc. The middle section is going to be somewhat covering progress and how you should itemize until you get to end game and what nuances to expect with your gear. I'm not going to tell you about every single passive point, by the way, like every single one or every part of the level, because if I tell you literally everything, you're never going to learn the game. So I'm not going to treat you like a baby. You can read tooltips. I believe in you. Then the third section, the last section, I'm going to talk about some of the tech, some of the issues, because there are a couple. There's a bug in particular that you need to be aware of, and also potentially for you theory crafters, tinkerers, experimenters, some potential alternative builds that I suspect may even surpass my original build, but maybe you'll have to tweet at me if that ends up being the case. So first of all, this planet is of course linked in the description below. Do bear in mind this is best in slot. You have found all the gear. You have a 4 LP Omnis because you're also capable of winning the lottery at any time. Do bear in mind this is more of things to strive for, not necessarily like you don't absolutely need everything here. The build, the footage you just saw, I have 1 exalted item. You saw me have 1200 HP, and of course no legendary potential on any of my items. I've been really unlucky with legendary potential so far, but this, when you get all of this gear or close to it, you're going to be destroying the planet basically. So let's cover the gear first and foremost. This is going to be somewhat of a dex stacker. There's a lot of damage scaling from dex. You get dodge from dex, of course, as well. And then there are passive skills that provide armor and I think a couple of other things like damage or something like that to the burb. First and foremost, you've got your dagger. The base, I've gone with a side because I like the idea of the dodge. You could also go for a Chris if you would like, and you can scale things like salt the wound with it. There's the bone dagger, which I believe is bleed, but it's only 35%, so not really worth. And of course, you could also go for an obsidian dagger. With a good roll, you can get a good 80% additional physical damage. Personally, though, I've gone with a sai. You want to get your physical, your damage over time, your chance to bleed, of course. That is going to be like your main focus outside of dex. More bleed stacks is priority above everything else, basically. I've also put chance to chill on hit as the sealed affix. The reason for that is if you chill things, it's indirect damage mitigation. If things are chilled, they attack less frequently, they fire things less frequently, and they can't move as far. So it's indirect damage mitigation. Very, very helpful and an easy thing to just whack onto a dagger. Falconer helm. It doesn't necessarily have to be a Falconer helm. I've gone with Falconer helm because of the +6 to dexterity. As mentioned, we're essentially a dex stacker. You could go for a Gorgon scale coif, which I believe is some cooldown reduction. There is also the blood visage, which is the dot. And then there is another one I have forgotten off the top of my head. but it's I think it's the Dragon Visage, which is crit multi. Now, the reason I'm mentioning crit multi, I'll go into a bit more detail later on. It works as long as you've got Salt the Wound, basically. If you haven't got Salt the Wound, don't bother with the crit multi. Then we've got the armor. I've gone with Woven Flesh. It works really, really well with Valdir's, which is over here, of course. Ideally, you want to get some LP on it, get some dex, and hopefully maybe even the +2 level 2 dive bomb. That can be quite tasty. It's not absolutely necessary. You could just go for an exalted armor with all those stats. Personally, though, I was a big fan of the overkill damage leached. It pretty much instantly heals you every time. You've got Omnis. This is, of course, going to be your the one item that you're going to really, really, really struggle to get. But if you do get it, it pretty much just perfects the build, because as soon as you get Omnis, your resistances will be massively fixed in a lot of ways. Obviously, it depends on the rolls, of course, but it will also enable you to get the ideal blessings rather than having to spec resistances into your blessings, which we'll talk about more later. You got Flayer's Pride. Pretty obvious. We're a bleed build. We want all the bleeds. We've gone for Block Chance as the tier 7 if you manage to get some LP on it, and some resistances, particularly all resistances, is very tasty on this shield if you can get it. I'm not going to break down every single item. If you do need a breakdown of all the items, you can have a look at my old video. I do go into a lot more detail about each and every one. Then you've got Thorn Slinger. You've got additional damage, of course. You've got the Fizz, you've got chance to bleed, movement speed, throwing attack speed, all very, very tasty for a build that is perpetually throwing things. Salt the Wound, as I mentioned earlier, you've got a bit of crit multi that scales with the effect of added critical strike multiplier converted to physical penetration with bleed. Very, very good. You want to get some dex on there again if possible, and some dual hybrid health and just big health. Then you got Blood of the Exile. Funnily enough, there's dex on there once more. Increased bleed duration is quite important. Bleed duration is something that if you can get good rolls on it, consider that a really, really good thing, because the longer the bleeds, the more likely you are to build stacks, and the more synergy that will have with Dive Bomb, which we'll go into in a moment. And then it got Valdir's. Valdir's is pretty much mandatory. I say mandatory. Once you get it, you'll suddenly feel godly and immortal because you're constantly healing. Even when I've got my 1200 HP on my current build, anything that hits me is immediately just recuperated. I get hit, the health spikes, and just jumps straight back up to 100% within a second. No exaggeration. Then you got the rings, Opal rings. So I've gone with Opal rings. Cooldown recovery isn't massively necessary, but it is kind of helpful for just bringing down the CDR for, or the cooldown for Dive Bomb. Otherwise, it's actually mostly for the +2. Just more dex, get all the dex. I've also sealed in the throwing damage -3 throwing mana cost. That is important. There was another streamer who was talking about nets, and since they've made this quote, I've been bombarded with questions about nets and how it's not viable because of the mana cost. That's completely inaccurate. Don't believe that person. Like, no shade, but they were like objectively incorrect. I have only gone on one boss fight, and that was Empowered Hero, and that was because he stands still a lot and you have to spam him, and he's quite tanky, and that was about it. I have otherwise never gone and all I had at the time as well was -3 throwing mana cost. So yeah, you will never go Plus, I didn't have the blessing that gave me the extra 60+ mana, which would put you up to around about 200%. I think I had about 120 mana, something silly like that at the time. But yeah, you don't have to worry about going it's nonsense. Don't believe that. So idols. It's idols, of course. You're gonna want to build to your needs. If you need to top up your resistances, then by all means do so. But otherwise, go ham with the damage. So you've got some small Eteran idols, which is dots and hybrid damage, fizz damage. You've got some humble idols, which is chance to bleed, of course, and more hybrid damage. You've got some ornate Majason idols, which is chance to bleed and more hybrid damage. I believe it's serrated of iron for these two that you want. And then that one is blighted of iron, I think. Yes. Blessings. Now, blessings, obviously, these again are, once you've got the perfect gear, these are the blessings you're going to want. Gold, drop rate, because you're probably Merchant's Guild. I recommend Merchant's Guild due to the unique item dependency. So get that gold meta in. You want the amulet drop rate because maybe you can get the omnis, who knows. Then you want, of course, health. You want dagger drop rate, although again you can customize this to your needs. Obviously, if you find your BiS dagger, you don't need the dagger drop rate anymore. Mana is really like just comfy. It's nice. It's not mandatory by any means. You can quite easily survive without it, but it's a good security blanket to have. Then you've got relic shard drop rate. Again, you can customize that one to your needs. Chance to bleed, of course, is a big one. There's probably a few you can have here. You've got, of course, the all resistances. If you don't have a woven flesh, you can get a big chunk of critical avoidance. But for the most part, you're probably just going to want to stick to the chance to bleed. Then here I've got class specific shards, mostly because you're going to want the plus nets on here and the dive bomb and everything else. Then you have block chance. It's huge. Get as much block chance as you can as possible. With best in slot, you can get 62%. It's not likely you'll get that. You're probably more likely to get something along around the lines of 40 to 50, I would say. But with best in slot, you can get a fair chunk of block chance. And then, of course, you got endurance. This one can also be somewhat adapted. I've gone with endurance just to make yourself a wee bit more tanky. Once you've got your health built up, you can survive quite a few one-shots if they manage to get through your block chance, your dodge chance, and your glancing blow chance, of course. Now I'm going to take you through the skills. Now you'll notice, and I've mentioned this in a previous video, all of the skills are attacks, and you might be thinking, wait, I can't use puncture, umbral braids, let's, aerial assault, and dive bomb all at the same time. It turns out, yes, you can. These two here, these first two, are essentially passives. These will synergize with other skills you've got and will be casted for you. So I'm going to go through the skills one by one, show you what you want to spec into, maybe allude to some alternatives in another section of the video, but for now, let's have a look at puncture. So for puncture, in a previous video, it previously stated in build planners that you could use bloodthirst with puncture on net still, but you may notice it now says directly using puncture and hitting at least one enemy grants you bleeding fury. We're not going to be using puncture directly, at least not once we've got nets. So we've not gone with hunger and bloodthirst. We did some napkin math. I did some napkin math back when we thought we could use it. I can see why they have changed it to directly using puncture. With these nodes and a now disabled node in dive bomb, it was possible to do 1 billion damage with dive bomb. Like, that's not an exaggeration. With these nodes, you could get approximately about 15 to 1600 stacks of bleed, and that with all the multipliers and I can't remember what the name of the node is, but there was a big node that added like an 80% multiplier, and you could be just shy of 1 billion damage. So that's probably why it's been changed, and I completely understand it, because of course that's insane. So what we've done instead is just gone straight all in on the bleed chance, of course. Physical shred is fantastic for this build, because that does apply to both bleed and hits. Then, of course, you've got the melee range, which is just nice for clear. Bit of armor shred, mostly because you need it to get to here, but it does kind of work with your hits as well, so not to worry there. You've also got timing. It says attack speed -12. You don't have to worry because it doesn't apply, because it's your nets triggering the puncture, so it's just instant anyway. So it's free 48% damage. And then I've whacked the last two nodes here into the maximum ailments 2, which will then scale the damage to 14% of multiplicative damage. So yeah, there are a couple of things you might want to do instead. You could potentially, I've not tested it, and I don't think it's going to be worth it, but you could go up here to get the extra poison chance and then convert it to bleed chance, just to get some more out of the puncture for more bleed stacks. To be honest, don't think it's really worth. You may as well just get the extra damage multiplier down here, in my opinion. Umbral blades. This is a pretty simple one. You've probably seen this before in other like Blade Dancer, Shadow Dagger builds. Pretty much the same here. You want to get your Blade Storms. You want to get everything to do with Blade Storms. You want your Shadow Daggers. And you want to, you especially want precision cuts, because otherwise when you do aerial assault, it drops the umbral blades and the blade storms, and they disappear off screen. They will piss off in the completely opposite direction to where you want them. So make sure you do get precision cuts as soon as you get the cacophony of steel node. So those two at the same time, if possible. I've also gone down here for the bleed chance. You won't get the haste chance on recall, of course, but more bleed chance is more damage, so definitely go for that. Nets, you want to add the puncture and multi-trap nodes. It does now say plus 10 mana. It was at this point that that other streamer said that it would no longer be viable. It is still viable. Like I said, it's nonsense. Don't worry about it. This is, of course, reliant on you having the nets on your plus level to nets on your relic. Once you get that, you can get these 3 points down here. Otherwise, go for everything else first. But once you get your relic with your +3 or +4, get this node down here. This one to get to that one. And you can also whack in a point in this node here. And you get some extra damage based on your dodge. And you've got a fair bit of dodge. Otherwise, you want to focus on these bad boys here, which is all bleed chance and triggering puncher with your nets. Aerial Assault. Aerial Assault is very nice. It's more of a traversal skill. It has a fair bit to your clear, but most of your damage is actually going to be coming from your nets, believe it or not. So for this one, you want to get your plumed daggers and your twilight strikes. You only need 2 points in twilight strikes because you can only have 3 blade storms at once, so you don't have to worry about the last point. Get your caltrops, get your bleed chance. This is kind of nice as well. It's not mandatory, but there's a bit of overlap with the caltrops, so you just get some extra stacks. Then you want to get these nodes as well, just to bring down the cooldown and the mana recovery, which is very, very tasty. You've got a couple of points spare depending on the gear that you've got, like if you've got an Omnis and whatnot. Honestly, I was kind of undecided with what to do with the last few points. I did whack one in here for missing health. You could put both the points in the domain of the Huntress just to get the extra dodge from the Featherstorm, because Featherstorm's a big cone area thing, so you've got quite a lot of room to play within it. So you may as well, if you want to get that extra dodge and not get struck as often. Then you have Dive Bomb, aka the I win button. Once you get Dive Bomb, you want to get the cooldown nodes, you want to get the bleed and the exsanguinating strike node. This is very, very important. This is what does a huge chunk of your damage. With the footage you saw earlier, I currently have around about 300% bleed chance. Probably going to spec another 200 or so into it once I've got all the gear that I want. With that, I'm hitting around about 500 to 600, sometimes 700 stacks of bleed, and I'm doing 1.5 million damage just with the consumption of the bleeds rather than the hit and the bleeds together. So you can get quite a bit of damage there. Up here, you do definitely want to get the United Assault first, and then once you've got a few extra points, you can whack them in Rush of the Hunt. Although it's not massively necessary, it does help with just being able to spam Dive Bomb more often. Next, we've got our passive skills. Pretty cut and dry. You obviously just want to start with some Swift Assassin for the attack speed, some Dex on Steady Hand, and then the Glancing Blow from Dodge and Parry. This is probably going to be all the throwing speed you want, and I'll go into that and explain as to why later, but do be mindful of that. Blade Dancer, you've probably going to put your last remaining points in this node, but for the most part, you want to get your dexterity and glancing blows. You're putting 2 points in here purely to get to this node. Otherwise, everything is pretty much going in Falconer. You want your health, your dodge, you want your more dodge, and your health converted to endurance threshold. That would be very nice once you start building up your actual health pool. You want your dex, of course. You want to whack 1 point into here, which will enable you to get more crimson strikes. Honestly, it's kind of tempting to either spec out of this and potentially into some damage elsewhere. I'll leave that up to you because you can, of course, get crimson shroud from your dive bombs, and vice versa. You could probably remove that point from dive bomb instead in lieu of having it in crimson strikes already. I've gone for blast radius as well. I just like having a lot of area on my caltrops, on Featherstorm, on dive bomb in particular, because once you've got all the area plus when you synergize it with the dive bomb affix on your helmet, you just clear so much of the screen just by pressing one button, especially if everything's bleeding. Then, of course, you've got deflect and weave. You only want 4 points in this. If you put in 5 points, it will convert all of your block chance to glancing blow. That's not necessary. You're going to get a fair bit of glancing blow already from the passive nodes, and of course dust crowds that you'll be triggering. So you want to just have the second layer of block and then glancing blow just for additional defense. Down here, you want more dex, more armor, no, more dodge, pretty self-explanatory. More damage, very self-explanatory. More damage is increased over time. Plus, of course, it will add further bleed to your Falcon, which will enable you to build up more bleed stacks. Then, of course, you've got the armor per dex node, Stymphalian feathers, as it were. Increased armor on Falcon hits as well, which is pretty much all the time, so you get 100% uptime on that. Likewise, on Tailwind, you pretty much have 100% uptime because your bird is hitting every second near enough. Then you want to whack 1 point and final souvenir to enable you to get strike their flank, which is just more damage, which is nice for all involved. Okay, now let's talk progression. So, you're a new player or vaguely new player. You've started your Falconer. You're a rogue. You don't know what to do. You don't know where you are. It's okay. I've got you. Thankfully, the order you acquire your skills is literally going to be the order you want to use them in the first place. So you're going to get puncture first and foremost. When you get puncture, you could, if you like, use a bow and spec into blood first temporarily. It's not really necessary. You may as well just take the route and head towards shadow daggers. Once you've got umbral blades, you immediately want to get to cacophony of steel and spec into precision cuts. Then you can throw out 2 blades and then fill with puncture in between. You'll eventually get nets. As soon as you get nets, you want to spec into spear trap as soon as possible, as well as server of tricks. That will mean that you will no longer need to use puncture directly. And again, you can just throw out umbral blades and then nets whenever there is uptime of the umbral blades. When you get aerial assault, things become immediately smoother. Like, nets is quite smooth gameplay. Not everyone's a fan of it, but I think it's... You can clear stuff with like 2 button clicks is what I'm trying to say, basically. You can do entire echoes, empowered monoliths, just with nets if you really want to. That's how actually strong they are. But when you do get aerial assault, it just makes things so much faster because you're basically flying around the echo, not giving a damn, and things just die in your wake. When you do get aerial assault, you do, of course, want to get into this side of things immediately. So Twilight Strike, so you can then throw umbral blades without throwing umbral blades. And of course, you want the plumed daggers, which does synergize, by the way, with lethal darkness, which means that your blade storms are applying 2 shadow dagger debuffs per hit. So that's 6 times a second. Then when you've got your aerial assault, you want to move on to dive bomb. When you get dive bomb, you want to rush exsanguinating strike pretty much straight away, and then get united assault. Eventually, when you get some extra points, you can whack it into rush of the hunt. Otherwise, you want to go for rushing wings and devastating dive. This then becomes the build. You've completed it. Congratulations, you are now successful. As I said before, spam dive bomb whenever it's off cooldown. When you're in echoes, you'll probably barely use it. On bosses, do it off cooldown, but when you're in echoes, you're pretty much just doing nets and aerial assault. In fact, a lot of the times you'll just be doing aerial assault, throw a net or 2 just to reduce the cooldown of aerial assault, and then you just move on and things just die in your wake. You may want to have the overlay map on in case unique items are dropping, so you can actually see it on the map, because you're not going to stand around. Otherwise, like I said, nets clear echoes very, very quickly. It's very good for arena as well because of all the caltrops dropping everywhere. And I'll discuss the more technical side of things and how that works in the last section. When it comes to your gear, as I mentioned before, this is the ambitious goals of like best in slot. You're not going to get all of this with 4LP, obviously. The dagger, I've pretty much got this dagger already. I think the only thing I'm missing was the chill on hit, and I've got health on kill instead, but otherwise I basically have this dagger. It's the only exalted item I have at the moment on my actual build. Otherwise, you definitely want Woven Flesh because it synergizes so well with Valdir's. Valdir's is pretty mandatory. I say mandatory, you can survive without it. It's definitely serviceable without it, but once you do get it, you become immortal. So it's definitely something you want to prioritize. Omnis isn't necessarily going to be something you're going to want to strive to get. It does fix resistances and then allows you to change up your blessings. There is potentially an alternative you could go for, and it may surprise you. I sound like a BuzzFeed article, but you might want to get a Bleeding Heart. Bleeding Hearts, especially in the Merchant's Guild, are relatively achievable, like a 3 to 4 LP Bleeding Heart. You could probably get it. You wouldn't want the health regen, or well, you're not bothered rather about the lack of health regen. You don't cast spells, so you don't put bleeds on yourself. So a free 5 to 9 damage leech to synergize again with Valdir's and Woven Flesh. It's definitely a possibility. Probably you're going to go with a Bone Amulet though, I suspect, just for the resistances. And then you can throw in a Sealed Affix as well to fill in some extra need that you might have. Idols. Basically, these idols will carry you throughout the game. There's pretty much no difference that you can make. There are a couple of idols that you might want to change. You might want to get some extra area or more life or resistances. Obviously, adjust them again to your needs. If you've got to fill up some resistances, by all means do so. I'm personally not bothered about having only 59% void resistance because in my experience, void damage isn't a huge concern. You can avoid it 99% of the time, and then those things that do occasionally hit you, you can probably survive even with just 59 res. Blessings, these are going to probably change a fair bit as you progress with your gear. As I mentioned before, these are probably what you want once you've got your gear in a really, really good spot. Once you've no longer got a reliance of resistances, you can start migrating to these ones. Otherwise, during like the early game of monoliths, before you get into empowered and whatnot, try and get your resistances because they're going to be a huge source of them. They provide obviously a big chunk, sometimes up to 70%. So do focus on your blessings. Finally, in this last section, I'm going to cover some of the tech that's involved, any potential issues you may run into. Is it hardcore viable? Why did you choose this over that? Covering all of those things. And also, perhaps for you tinkerers, experimenters, your theory crafters, I've got some juice for you that you might want to experiment with. And if you do experiment, by the way, tweet at me at Brian the Pirate on Twitter. Let me know if it was successful, or if it did turn out to be better. So let's start with, is this hardcore viable? Technically, yes. It's very, obviously, unique item dependent, however, so I probably wouldn't use it as like a hardcore cycle starter, probably a second character instead. There's also something very important to note. There is currently, at the time of recording, a bug with aerial assault. The issue is, once in every, I would say, 100 or so aerial assaults, you'll find yourself just getting stuck in place. You'll go to cast aerial assault, and rather than you traveling to where you clicked, you just stay in place. Now, most of the time, it's not too big an issue because you just quickly throw some nets and this breaks the lock. But every now and then it doesn't work and you have to specifically do another aerial of assault, which might be on cooldown. And on one occasion, nothing worked. As you can see on screen now, I was trying to do many things and it just wouldn't let me move. I ended up having to use a town portal and abandoning the echo, and of course having to start from scratch. That's only happened once, and like I said, it only happens once in every 100 or so aerial assaults. I don't know what causes it. Sometimes I'll go 3 or 4 monolith echoes without it happening, and then sometimes it will happen multiple times in one echo. Hopefully that gets fixed soon. With that in mind, I would of course avoid hardcore until that's fixed, because if it suddenly happens during a boss fight, maybe you're fighting Lagon, you're going to find his big crab claw wank hand smashing you in the head and dying very quickly. Now to cover the tech. So, as I mentioned before, these two nodes do not work with puncture if it is being used by a net. So please stop asking me about it. Next, When it comes to umbral blades, as I mentioned before, you want to make sure that you've got precision cuts. Otherwise, the blades will just go off in random directions and it's really weird and doesn't really behave very well. When it comes to your nets, obviously we focus quite a lot in the caltrops. Now, the reason for this is the caltrops, as they fall or are thrown, they count as a hit. Then they leave essentially a degen on the floor. That degen also stacks. So as I mentioned before, it's quite nice when you're, say, in arena, because you just basically have caltrops all over the place. Things are running at you and end up dying before they even reach you because they're just getting hit by so many bleeds. You want to get as much caltrops as possible because every time you throw an ability or a net, you're dropping extra caltrops and extra bleeds, extra stacks. It's fantastic. Great way to make it work. Now, with Aerial Assault, originally, I picked Featherstorm because I assumed it was lots of teeny tiny little hits, lots of feathers hitting. It's a dot. It's a degen. It's not lots of teeny tiny hits. So when you do your Aerial Assault and it does the Featherstorm, it counts as one hit. I've still kept Featherstorm because, one, you can get the extra dodge from it. And also it's some supplemental damage in a big wide area. It's pretty good for clear. Even though you've not spec'd into hit damage as much, it kills most trash pretty quickly. With that in mind, again, you want to make sure you get your caltrops because you're just constantly dropping them. Likewise, additional caltrops halfway through. Once you build up some area damage, there'll be some overlap. So you'll do one area assault and drop 2 sets of caltrops on top of each other, which is great against bosses for getting those extra bleed stacks in. Going back to nets for a moment, a lot of the questions I've been asked is people were like, should I get lots of cooldown reductions so I can just spam aerial assault? No. Honestly, you'll be able to spam aerial assault relatively frequently anyway, but you will in fact do more damage with nets. A lot of people think nets are like a bad skill. Like there's been a number of people who've gone, oh, I don't like nets. All they do is like immobilize the target. One, that's actually huge. You're literally stopping a target at range from being able to reach you. Nets are very strong. You want you absolutely want nets because they again prevent you from receiving so much damage because you're constantly out of range of things. Another thing with the nets is you can throw them incredibly quickly and the punctures trigger incredibly quickly. I would be mindful of how much throwing speed you have, however, because you can only have a maximum of 6 nets. So if you get too much throwing speed, you could potentially despawn your traps before they trigger the puncture. I mentioned earlier that you've probably got enough throwing speed just from your passive tree. I've tested it out. It's very comfy. Just using nets, if I stood at a target dummy and just spammed nets, you can reach an excess of 700 stacks of bleed, and that's just with the 300% that I've got. That's not including an extra, I think, 200% that I could probably get on my gear. So as you can imagine, it's very good for DPS. You build up your stacks really quickly, and when you're getting them up to like 700, the tick rate I think was something like 200,000 at that point, with room to improve even further. So do bear that in mind. And the punctures have really good range on them. You'll notice some of the animations go quite a distance, like a good few inches of your screen gets covered. Now, I mentioned before, there's potentially 2 builds or 2 variations of this build that you could go down. One of them is the crit multi path. You've got Salt the Wound, which of course synergizes with bleed penetration based on how much crit multi you have on your gear. It's very important it's specifically to your gear. So you might want to get rid of maybe some of the increased damage over time damage, or maybe even some of the physical damage in lieu of some crit multi instead. I haven't tested it. The most testing I did was with the helm that provides you with crit multi, and it was pretty much with a good roll on par with the bloody visage or blood visage, which is the one that gives you increased bleed chance. So it might be something worth looking into, because of course you're going to be using shadow daggers, which is a free critical strike. It's guaranteed free crits when those procs proc, as it were. So yeah, crit multi could definitely be viable, and may even, if you get the balance right, surpass the build that I've shown you today. Another thing that you could potentially do, despite what I literally just said about it, is something with nets. you could potentially get all the attack speed, all of the throwing speed specifically, just so you're throwing nets so fast. You can maybe then spec out of puncture and spec into maybe smoke bomb instead or something to that effect. And then you just spam nets so fast with the additional caltrops as well. That potentially could get you really, really high bleed stacks. I haven't really tested it, mostly because I haven't got the time. I've got a load of other builds that I want to make videos for you guys for. But that's something that I would be very interested to see maybe someone else try. So if you do, as I say, try any of those two alternatives or experiment a bit with it, if it's successful, let me know. I would genuinely love to hear that. So do please tweet at me or come into my Twitch stream and let me know. Otherwise, that's it for the Bloody Bird build. I am going to be making a cold acid flask build, which is going to be working with explosive trap. That's the next one. So if you like the sound of that, do feel free to subscribe. If you liked the video, I do recommend you give it a like as well, because it helps the algorithm gods, which of course helps me as well. Another build that I'll be doing after the acid flask one, by the way, is going to be the Falcon punching glove cinder strike ones. You know, the ones that are unarmed and things like that. I'm potentially gonna meme a bit with it and convert it to poison, and maybe make it kind of nuclear with just like huge area of effect. I like to make meme builds rather than like your cookie cutter builds, so that's something to look forward to in the future. Also, I do stream on Twitch. I mentioned it earlier, twitch.tv/Brian the Pirate. Do feel free to drop by. If you ever have any questions about builds, you can just drop in and ask me them, and I'll answer them as best as I can. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching. Farewell. I'll remember you. Tequila.